It happened one night with my young friend Mark. At the time, he had just turned 18 and I was 20. His family and mine had always been close, so his parents came over for my dad's birthday. I hadn't seen him in a while, and when I saw him walk in, I was honestly taken aback. This guy, despite being younger, had grown into such a handsome man. He had this confident yet laid-back vibe, and something about the way he smiled just hit differently that night. When we greeted each other, we hugged like we always did, but it felt different. There was a kind of tension, or maybe a spark, like we both sensed something unspoken. During dinner, we sat across from each other, and I couldn't help but steal glances. Every time our eyes met, it felt like there was a secret we were both keeping but weren't quite ready to share. After a while, you know how these family gatherings go. We all split off, and Mark and I ended up in my room. It was kind of automatic, really. We'd always hung out there as kids, playing video games or listening to music, so it wasn't weird at all. But this time, there was an energy in the room that was definitely different. It wasn't just two old friends catching up. There was something else simmering just beneath the surface. So, there we were, sitting in my room, both a little tipsy from the wine we had at dinner. The room felt warmer than usual, the kind of warmth that makes your skin buzz a little. We sat next to each other on my bed, close enough that our shoulders touched, but not quite facing each other. We were talking about random stuff, college plans, stupid memories from when we were younger, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting to him. Mark had always been good-looking, but that night I saw him differently. His jawline was sharper, his eyes softer. The way he ran his fingers through his hair made me want to reach out and do the same. I kept stealing glances at his lips, wondering what they'd feel like, taste like. I felt my heart race just thinking about it, but I kept my cool. We'd always been like brothers, and I didn't want to mess that up. Still, there was this tension between us that I couldn't ignore. Every time he laughed, I felt it in my chest. When his knee brushed mine, it sent a jolt through me. I wanted to close the space between us, to kiss him, to explore every inch of him, but I held back. I didn't even know if he was into guys. And even if he was, what if he didn't see me that way? I couldn't risk it. But in my mind, I was already there. I imagined leaning in, pressing my lips to his, feeling his body under my hands. I wanted to pull him close, to feel his breath against my skin. I couldn't stop thinking about how his scent would fill my senses, how his skin would feel against mine. The more I tried to push those thoughts away, the stronger they got. We kept talking, but the words felt like background noise. The real conversation was happening in the silence between us, in the looks that lingered just a little too long. I could feel the spark growing, but I wasn't sure if it was just me or if he felt it too. So I stayed quiet, trying to act normal, while my mind raced with all the things I wanted to do but couldn't say. At some point, the warmth of the room, the buzz from the wine, and the quiet tension between us became too much. I hadn't even realized I drifted off. The last thing I remembered was Mark talking, his voice low, calm, and steady. It was the kind of voice that could pull you in, make you forget everything else. I must have closed my eyes, thinking I'd only rest for a moment. But the line between being awake and asleep blurred, and before I knew it, I was out. When I woke up, it wasn't gradual. I didn't ease back into consciousness. Instead, it was like being jolted awake by something I couldn't quite place. The room was dim, the only light coming from the hallway seeping through the slightly open door. It took a second to process where I was, but then I felt it. A hand, warm and steady, resting gently on my thigh. I blinked, my mind racing to catch up with what was happening. I turned my head slightly, and there he was. Mark was sitting next to me, closer than before. His face was so near mine that I could feel his breath, warm and slightly uneven. His eyes weren't the casual, friendly eyes I'd seen earlier that night. They were intense, focused, like he was searching for something in me. For a second, everything felt suspended in time. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud I was sure he could hear it. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. Was this really happening? But I didn't move away. I didn't want to. It was like every thought I'd pushed down, every spark I'd ignored was suddenly out in the open. He didn't say a word. Instead, he leaned in, slowly, like he was waiting for me to pull back. I didn't. Our lips met, and everything else faded. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant. It was like we were both testing the waters, unsure if we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But then it deepened. The hesitation melted away, replaced by something more intense, more certain. I could feel his warmth, the softness of his lips, and the way he moved so deliberately, so carefully. It was like every touch, every breath, held a meaning we hadn't been able to say out loud. My mind was spinning, but in the best way. All the thoughts I'd had earlier, the ones I tried to ignore, came rushing back. I wanted this. I wanted him. His hand on my thigh moved slightly, his fingers tracing light patterns that sent shivers up my spine. I mirrored his movements, my own hands finding their way to his shoulders, then his back. There was an urgency, but also a softness. We were figuring this out together, guided by instinct and the unspoken connection that had been building between us for who knows how long. The room felt warmer, the air thick with the tension that had finally been broken. Every nerve in my body was awake, every sense heightened. I could feel the slight tremor in his breath, the way his fingers tightened slightly when our eyes met. There was a vulnerability in it, a rawness that made it feel even more intense. This wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about all the things we hadn't said, all the moments that had led up to this. When we finally pulled back, our foreheads rested together, both of us breathing a little heavier. I looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of regret or hesitation. There wasn't any. His gaze was soft, almost tender, but there was a fire behind it too. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence between us said more than words ever could. There was a moment of shock, I won't lie. It was written all over my face, but I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. The surprise wasn't just about what he was doing, but the fact that it was happening at all. All the unspoken tension between us was finally out in the open, and instead of feeling awkward or unsure, there was this overwhelming sense of rightness. Like everything had clicked into place. Our lips met again, and this time the kiss deepened. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, like we were both savoring every moment. His hands moved gently, exploring with a kind of careful intensity. There was a softness in the way he touched me, a tenderness that made everything feel more real. Every brush of his fingers sent shivers through me, and I couldn't help but respond, my own hands mirroring his movements. I remember feeling this wave of warmth and excitement, a kind of pleasure that was more than just physical. It was the way he looked at me, the way he moved, like he was learning every inch of me, taking his time. I let myself get lost in it in him. My body reacted instinctively, stretching under his touch, leaning into the sensation. There was an honesty in it, a vulnerability that made it all the more intense. When my hand found its way to him, I paused for a moment, taken aback. It was different, unexpected. It caught me off guard, but in the best way. I looked at him, eyes wide, and he just smiled, a mix of confidence and something softer. It wasn't a competition or a comparison. It was just another piece of him that I was discovering, another layer to the connection we were building. Everything about the moment felt heightened. The touch, the taste, the way our breaths mingled. We weren't just two friends experimenting. We were exploring something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath the surface. The way he guided me, gentle but sure, made me feel safe, wanted. There was no rush, no pressure. Just two people figuring each other out, learning what made the other tick. The room was filled with the sound of our breathing, the soft rustling of clothes, and the faint noise of voices from downstairs. I could hear the laughter of our parents, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of conversation. It felt like the world outside our little bubble was still moving, unaware of what was unfolding between Mark and me. The pressure of those sounds, of life going on just beyond the door, only added to the tension that was building between us. It was like a soundtrack to everything we were doing, reminding us that we were both teetering on the edge of something new, something risky, and yet something we couldn't stop. Mark's hand was still on me, but it wasn't just a casual touch anymore. His fingers traced the lines of my body, moving with a purpose, exploring in ways that felt both familiar and entirely new. His eyes never left mine, and there was something in the way he looked at me that made everything else seem distant. It was as if, for that moment, we were the only two people in the world, bound by this unspoken understanding. The kisses we shared were no longer slow and hesitant. They were passionate, intense, and full of desire. His lips moved against mine with a new urgency, a quiet desperation. There was a rhythm to it, a back and forth that felt like we were both trying to communicate something we hadn't yet said out loud. I could feel my body responding in ways I didn't quite understand, but it felt like my every nerve was alive, buzzing with anticipation. I had never kissed anyone like this before, not with this kind of hunger, not with this depth. And I could tell Mark hadn't either. We were both in uncharted territory, but it didn't feel wrong. It felt real, as if we were discovering something that had always been there, buried just beneath the surface. As I kissed him back, my hands found their way to his chest, then his waist. The warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips was intoxicating, like fire and silk wrapped into one. I could feel his heart beating beneath my palms, matching the frantic rhythm of my own. Every time I touched him, every time I felt him move, I was reminded of how much I wanted him. But there was more to it than just the physical attraction. It was the connection we were building, the way our bodies seemed to naturally sync up, responding to each other's movements and desires. But then, the noise from downstairs grew louder, the laughter more distinct, the voices closer. The sudden awareness of it made the tension in the room feel even thicker. I could feel my body tensing, a knot of anxiety building in my stomach. What if someone heard us? What if someone came upstairs? I glanced at Mark, searching his face for any hint of doubt, any sign that he was second-guessing what we were doing. But there was nothing. His expression was focused, intense, and if anything, he seemed more certain than ever. Its hand slid from my thigh to my waist, pulling me closer, as if to remind me that this was what we both wanted. Then, just as I thought I might lose my nerve, he kissed me again. This time it was deep, his lips pressing firmly against mine, his tongue tracing the shape of my mouth in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't think, couldn't do anything except feel. I responded, kissing him back with as much intensity as I could muster, my hands moving to the back of his neck, pulling him closer, as if trying to fuse our bodies together. His hand slid lower, teasing as if he was waiting for me to react, waiting for me to give him a sign that it was okay. And I did. My hands moved down his body, exploring the muscles in his chest, his stomach, and the weight his body tensed under my touch. Every inch of him was like a discovery, each touch building on the last, each moment pushing us further down this path we'd both been tiptoeing around for so long. But as we continued, I could hear footsteps coming up the stairs. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, and my heart started pounding even harder in my chest. I broke the kiss and looked towards the door, panic rising in my chest. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and I could hear my mom's voice, clear and bright, calling out to us. "Hey, you guys all right up there? Want something to drink or eat?" I froze. My mind was racing, my body still tingling from the kiss and the closeness we shared. I had to think quickly. "We're good," I called back, trying to sound casual. "Just playing Xbox. Thanks, though." There was a pause before my mom's voice echoed from the hallway. "All right, just checking in. Let us know if you need anything." As soon as the sound of her footsteps faded down the stairs, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But Mark didn't seem fazed. His hand was still on me, still guiding me, and when I looked back at him, he just smiled. That smile made everything else fade away again. It was like we had our own world now, a secret we'd shared that no one else could touch. He leaned in again, this time kissing my neck, slow and deliberate. I gasped at the sensation, the way his lips moved against my skin. I felt his body shift above me, the pressure of his chest against mine, the way our bodies were starting to mold together. He kissed down my neck, his hand still on my waist, his breath warm against my skin. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice low and husky, sending a thrill through me. "I want you." And that was it. Those words, that tone, made everything feel even more intense. It was like something snapped inside me, some last bit of hesitation falling away. I wasn't just responding to him anymore. I was fully lost in this moment, in this connection, in everything that we were doing. We didn't speak much after that. The kiss grew more frantic, more desperate, and every touch felt like it was building towards something we couldn't stop. Something we didn't want to stop. The passion between us was undeniable, raw, and powerful. Every movement, every touch, was more than just physical. It was emotional deep. We were both crossing a line we couldn't uncross, and neither of us seemed to care. We were lost in each other in this moment, in the quiet space between us that no one else could touch. And for the first time, I felt like I truly knew him. Not just as a friend, but as something more, something deeper. I was more aware of the emotions that swirled in the air around us, the way I felt in his presence, the way he seemed to be discovering me in the most gentle, careful way. It wasn't just about the surface of what was happening. There was a deeper connection, a tenderness that grew the more we explored each other. Even as the moment deepened, there was this palpable sense of care, as though we both realized we were giving each other something important. There was no rush. There was no sense of urgency to force anything. It was more like we were in the middle of a shared experience, one where time didn't seem to matter as much. The world outside, the sounds of our parents, the laughter and clinking of glasses, faded into the background, and all that was left was the space we occupied together. I could feel every shift in his body, the way he moved with patience, giving me time to adjust to the closeness. He seemed to sense every little change in my expression, every subtle movement, and he responded to it in kind. I couldn't help but notice how we mirrored each other. Even though it was something neither of us had ever done before, we both seemed to know what to do. We moved together, responding to the unspoken cues, taking our time with each step. When it became more intimate, when we were fully locked in this quiet moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. It wasn't just about the physicality of being close, but about how we were both allowing ourselves to be completely open with each other. It felt like a complete shift from everything we'd known before. No longer was this about the games we played or the friendships we shared. Now, it was about discovering a different side to each other, one that was more private, more vulnerable. And yet, it wasn't something I was afraid of. If anything, I felt safer than I had ever felt. The way our bodies responded to each other was a new experience, both in terms of what I felt physically and emotionally. Every touch, every movement, felt like it carried weight. I could feel the difference in how we reacted. It was as though we were both learning each other's language, each other's boundaries and comfort zones. I didn't feel pressured at any point. Everything was slow, deliberate, and it felt like we were both giving each other space to grow into this. As things continued, I could tell Mark was just as present as I was. I could feel it in how he held me, how he kissed me, how he touched me. There was an emotional closeness building that mirrored the physical one, and it felt like we were both learning how to be with each other in a way that was deeply meaningful. It wasn't just about desire or attraction. It was about trust, about letting go of everything else in the world, and just focusing on each other. It was intense, yes, but it wasn't overwhelming. As things built between us, the intensity of the moment reached its peak. His eyes locked with mine, and there was this quiet question, a hint of anticipation in his expression. I understood what he wanted, and without needing to say anything, I nodded, feeling my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. I shifted, turning around slowly, and he moved closer, his presence grounding me as I settled in front of him. He knelt, his hands finding their place, steadying me, his touch gentle yet firm. Everything felt deliberate, as though we were exploring new territory with a quiet reverence. I could feel his breath against me, his hands guiding me, and my own movements were cautious at first, growing more assured as we both adjusted to this new intimacy. There was a rhythm to it, a silent communication where every motion, every response built on the connection we shared. His body reacted to every small movement, his breathing shifting in tandem with mine. It felt like we were discovering each other all over again, each sensation heightened by the intensity of our connection. I arched slightly, feeling the way his hands moved, supporting me, holding me in place. There was this deep, almost electric energy between us, an awareness of every touch, every breath, every subtle shift. When the moment reached its peak, there was a sense of completion, a quiet satisfaction that settled over both of us. It wasn't just the physical release, it was the emotional depth we had explored, the vulnerability we had shared. We were both breathing heavily, the room filled with a quiet sense of warmth and connection. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. We were just there, together, lying close, the quiet afterglow wrapping around us like a soft blanket. Eventually, reality started to seep back in. We knew we couldn't stay like this forever. The sounds of our parents downstairs reminded us that the world hadn't paused for us, even if it felt that way. We quickly got dressed, exchanging small glances that held a mixture of emotions, contentment, a bit of disbelief, and that lingering excitement of having crossed a line together. As we headed downstairs, it was almost surreal, like stepping back into a different world. The normalcy of it all, the laughter, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, felt strange after what we just shared. My heart was still racing, my mind replaying everything that had happened, and I could feel a heat in my face that I couldn't quite shake. My mom noticed, of course. She had that knowing look, the one parents get when they sense something's up. "Why are you so red?" she joked, laughing as she looked between me and Mark. "Did you just run a marathon up there?" I forced a smile, feeling a mix of nervousness and amusement bubbling up inside me. "Nah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just tense from trying to take Mark out in Mortal Kombat." It was a weak excuse, but it worked. She laughed, shook her head, and went back to her conversation. Mark and I exchanged a quick glance, a shared secret passing between us. There was an unspoken understanding now, a deeper bond that went beyond words. We both knew that nothing would quite be the same after this, and honestly, I didn't want it to be.